is no Marxism-Leninism without atheism. Atheism permeates every area of their worldview. Marxists have turned to evolution to explain how we got here and who we are. But evolution doesn't answer the question why. Why are we here? Why should we treat others as equals? Marx turned to the philosophy of dialectical materialism to answer this question.
Having disposed of God, Marx concluded that dialectical materialism was the only philosophy for understanding the world. He believed in materialism. Materialism says that what is seen in nature is all that exists. And because nature is made up of matter, that is all there is to the real world. Man is simply matter in motion and nothing more. There is no soul, no heaven or hell or afterlife. There are no angels, nothing but the physical world. Lenin agreed with Marx. Matter is the objective reality given to us in sensation. Lenin believed that matter is eternal, not created. He thought that not only our lives, but also our minds and even our consciousness evolved from this eternal matter. Marx and Lenin believed Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest fit perfectly with the ideas of Georg Wilhelm Hegel, one of the most influential 19th century German philosophers. Hegel developed what is called the dialectic. The dialectic described the relationship between various things. For example, if there is an idea, a thesis, and an opposing idea, an antithesis, these would conflict and clash, and eventually combine, resulting in a new idea, a synthesis, which is the best elements of the two.
Hegel suggested that ideas come in conflicts. There's a thesis, a positive, and an antithesis, or an antithesis, a negative. And as these ideas come in conflict, always this combat between ideas that are opposites, there emerges a synthesis out of the two. Then this new synthesis becomes a new thesis, a positive, which by necessity brings about the emergence of its opposite, an antithesis or antithesis. And its conflict creates a new synthesis. And one has this process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, until in Hegel's idea, the battle of ideas created an ultimate notion of an ideal of the perfect, the good.
Marx applied Hegel's theory to history and came up with the concept of class struggle. Ruling classes and oppressed classes conflict and combine over time, eventually leading to the perfect synthesis of the classless society. Marx also combined the idea of the dialectic with his materialism, creating a unique hybrid philosophy called dialectical materialism.
Marx thought that his dialectical materialism gave him a clue to understanding history. He said if you go back in human history, you find that there were three major periods of time, each of which illustrated in some way or other what he called dialectical materialism. Those three periods of time were, first of all, slavery, which would be the ancient world, then feudalism, the medieval world, and then capitalism, which is the world of Marx's own time. Now, during each of these three periods of history, there was a struggle between two groups of people. That's the dialectics, the struggle, conflict.
Lenin also adapted these ideas, believing that Marx first turned the dialectic right side up and then made it his own. Dialectical materialism says that all of life is constantly evolving, but this evolution results from the clash of opposing forces. Engels. Nature is the proof of dialectics. All nature, from the smallest thing to the biggest, from a grain of sand to the sun, from the protozoa to man, is in a constant state of coming into being and going out of being, in a constant flux, in a ceaseless state of movement and change. But how do these changes come about? Marxists believe that nature acts dialectically, that change does not take place in a series of straight lines, but in a series of advances and retreats. It's like driving a nail. You don't raise a hammer, bring it crashing down, and keep pushing. When the blow has spent itself, you raise the hammer and hit the nail again. The withdrawal of the hammer is just as important as its downward thrust.
By applying this principle to change in society, Marxist-Leninists believe that retreat is just as important as advance. They move away from a goal in order to surge toward it later. The communist strategy is to build up extreme pressure and then withdraw, relieving the tension. And it is during this calm period, when others' defenses are down, that the communists are most likely to get what they want.
Doing what I'm meant to do. Can't take you with me, my lover, but it won't be the same without you. I know you don't feel the same as me. You promised me you want to. Say alright. Without you wishing you were here with me tonight, tonight.
KNC.
Hi, this is Alan Kepler on the Smooth Jazz Top 20 Countdown. We have a real treat for you today. Live from London, it's Paul Hardcastle, who on this very day went to #1 with Lucky Star. In fact, it's his 9th #1 here in the States. Hey, Paul, welcome. Hey, listen, first of all, how would you describe what it takes to achieve your ambitions? And what's your outlook on life in general?
That's a good question, actually.
This life is no rehearsal. One chance to live our dream. Here today, gone tomorrow. Can we fulfill our destiny? Time flies, it's no illusion. No one lives forever. You've got one chance to make it happen. One life to live your way. Don't stop, reach for heaven. One chance, so make your choice today. Make a wish, keep it a secret. Why should you live with regrets? Don't give up, or always remember the chance you missed, the time you'll not forget. You've got one chance to make it happen. One life to live your way. Don't stop, reach for heaven. One chance, so make your choice today. Here today, gone tomorrow. Live a dream. You got one chance to make it happen. One life to live your way. It's up to you. Don't stop. Reach for heaven. Reach for heaven. One chance, so make your choice today. One chance. Here today, gone tomorrow.
That's a good question, actually. What advice have I got for someone that's trying to achieve their goal in life? Well, first of all, I would say never give up. Believe in what you're doing, believe in yourself, and just go for your dream. I think you only get one chance at what you're trying to do, so I think take it. In fact, I believe you only get one really good chance in life, and I think you should make the most of it. Here today, gone tomorrow, as they say.
Here today, gone tomorrow.
Here today, gone tomorrow. This life's not a rehearsal, is it? It's the real thing, so I think you really have to make the most of it. Time really does fly.
Time flies.
Here today, gone tomorrow. You only get one chance.
One chance to make it happen.
One chance.
One chance to make it happen.
One chance.
Seem like the world situation in a stagnation. In a stagnation. In a stagnation. All the major players among the nations in a circular delirium. In a dimension. Looking for the restart button in the program. Too far along, too far along, too far along. World situation stagnation. Being rewarded for delirium. Various amnesia upon the standing. Being paid bonus frustration. World situation stagnation. They shall turn their swords into plowshares. For the greater good of the peace in this stagnation. World situation. Rich man and poor man. Cycle of precession. The return stand. Unto the old lion shall be the gathering. In this stagnation.
Forgive them, Jaja, oh forgive them, 'cause they know not what they have done. Forgive them, Jaja, oh forgive them, for they know not what they have done. They have robbed us, they have robbed us, they have robbed us of our culture. They have robbed us, they have robbed us, they have robbed us of our position. But forgive them, Jaja, oh forgive them, for they know not what they have done. But protect us, Jaja, oh protect us in every way. Protect us, Jaja, oh protect us in every way. Jaja, oh forgive them, for they know not what they have done. They have robbed us, they have robbed us, they have robbed us of our culture. They have robbed us, they have robbed us, they have robbed us of our position. But forgive them, Jaja, oh forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Forgive them, Jaja, oh forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Protect us, Jaja, oh protect us in every way. Oh, protect us, Jaja, oh protect us in every way. Oh, protect us, Rasta, oh protect us in every way. Protect us, Jaja, oh protect us along the way. Protect us, Jaja, oh protect us, 'cause they know not what they are doing. Protect us, Jaja, oh protect us, 'cause they know not what they are doing.
dollar is the most remarkable achievement in the history of money. Think of it. This piece of paper cost nothing to produce. There's nothing behind it except the goodwill of Ben Esperanti. And let us not forget the U.S. Congress. This piece of paper somehow still commands value and respect. How can the dollar be anything except the world's greatest monetary brand, the Coca-Cola of money? How can it be anything else but? Well, you just watch.
Since 1971, the U.S. dollar and the global financial system have been based solely upon faith. Faith in the guardian of that currency and of that system, the American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve. As the world's reserve currency, the U.S. dollar is how we measure our time, our products, our self-worth. Ours is a system based on trust and confidence, both of which began to disappear in the fall of 2007.
Plunging interest rates helped trigger the housing boom, but with interest rates climbing back, many homeowners are having a hard time paying their mortgages.
14 million people took a mortgage in the last 3 years. 7 million of them will lose their homes. This is crazy.
The Fed thought that this was a small problem. When the crisis was first talked about, this was a subprime mortgage problem. And it just kept growing and growing and growing.
Bear Stearns unraveling from some big bets on mortgages that have gone awry.
Government officials scrambling to prevent the collapse of the giant investment bank Lehman Brothers.
American International Group is seeking a $40 billion bridging loan from the Federal Reserve.
We are having an electronic run on the banks. The Federal Reserve's estimation was that $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States, would have collapsed the entire economy, and within 24 hours, the world economy would have collapsed. It would have been the end of our economic system as we know it.
Congress could not act in a timely way. Therefore, the Fed felt like it was important to stabilize the economy that we do it. That is not the normal role for a central bank, nor should it be.
While politicians debated, the Fed acted. It used its political independence and unlimited power to create money, to provide trillions of dollars in loans to corporations of all kinds, dwarfing the congressional aid that followed.
What people on Main Street and most politicians didn't understand is that if we didn't do something, General Electric would have pulled down, Berkshire Hathaway would have pulled down, General Motors would have pulled down, Citigroup would have pulled down Bank of America.
I mean, we came to the brink of the abyss and we looked over, and it was a long way down. The Fed really did have to step in.
And this is why the Fed was set up in 1913, to provide liquidity to the financial system as a whole at a time when you have a financial panic.
What do you know about the Federal Reserve?
Not much.
There is this perception that people have that the Fed is this kind of black box. Nobody quite understands it.
Take care of currency?
We're something about money.
They somehow regulate the stock market.
I think we're mysterious to people. I think they're not sure what we do.
Sounds like they're printing money. Nuh-uh.
One myth that's out there is that what we're doing is printing money. We're not printing money.
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. It's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
You've been printing money.
Well, effectively.
What exactly is the Fed's job? It does control the money supply, set interest rates, regulate banks, and is supposed to ensure the safety and soundness of the financial system.
The Fed is supposed to be the guardian of financial stability, preventing chaos in markets. Now, usually it can do that. in the summer of 2008, it couldn't do that, and we did get chaos.
But what caused the crisis in the first place? What brought the wealthiest nation in history to its knees? According to many economists and senior Fed officials, it was the Fed itself at the eye of the storm.
I'm on record as saying that I thought the Fed kept interest rates too low for too long.
That contributed to the bubble in housing prices.
This was warned about at the time. This was textbook. When you take rates that low, you're going to have a boom, and a bust is likely to follow.
The Fed failed to prevent the housing bubble, the predatory lending scandal, and utterly failed to prevent the financial crisis.
So we failed to regulate the most important part of our financial system.
And I don't think any of us who've ever worked at the Fed take any comfort from the fact that somebody screwed up. But I think it's important we recognize there were some big mistakes made.
Didn't the Federal Reserve System fail?
I know my time has run out, but I really fundamentally disagree with your point of view.
And I think there is a natural inclination that things are fixed, but things are not fixed.
Everybody wants to go back and say, things are fine now. Look, we solved our problem. We're just asking for another crisis.
This is an experiment. We've never done this before. We've never been here before. The Federal Reserve is really operating by the seat of their pants.
Now, the other side of that is that these are smart people, hardworking people who are trying to do the best that they can.
So I think we need to look very carefully at what the Fed did, and perhaps even more important than looking back and blaming people is the issue of what role should the central banks play going forward as we start thinking about this is a mess and we don't want to do this again.
This isn't the first time the central bank we created to protect our economy has instead led us to the brink. The real currency of the world is trust. As that slips away, can the Fed learn from the past? And can it do it in time?
We haven't had big countries going down, unable to save their system and collapsing. That's the crisis we have to worry about.
You have what degree of confidence in your ability to control this?
100%.
Before the Federal Reserve System, we didn't have a government bank. The banking system was very fragmented, and we experienced these panics in which monetary conditions would change.
A shock would hit the economy, the banks fail, and then other banks would fail.
Bank customers would become suspicious, and they would want to pull their money out of that bank, and then some other people would be afraid that their bank would go, and so people would want to pull their money out of deposits and withdraw the money as currency.
The banks would not have the currency to pay out, and they would just close their doors.
There was no lender of last resort. Okay, you didn't have a central bank like the Bank of England that could provide reserves to the New York banks.
1907 was a sort of a watershed panic.
The panic of 1907 was the straw that broke the camel's back. The U.S. is the biggest economy in the world. Americans are saying, gee, other countries with central banks are not having so many financial crises. Why are we?
They said, wait a minute. The U.S. government couldn't deal with this crisis. What's wrong with us? The Brits have the Bank of England, and the Germans have the Reichsbank. Something has to get done here.
In 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich summoned New York's most powerful bankers to an island off the coast of Georgia to secretly negotiate plans for an American central bank. Traveling under false names in a private railroad car, the great secrecy of this expedition would foster conspiracy theories for decades to come.
Later on, when people got wind of this, they said, uh-oh, it's the same old story of the rich guys creating something that'll be good for them and not so good for all of us.
Different parts of the country were suspicious of some proposals that left New York or Wall Street or Washington too much in control. It was actually Woodrow Wilson who proposed what I consider to be an ingenious compromise, which we have today, a decentralized central bank.
12 reserve banks that would be owned by the member banks, and a central coordinating authority in the Federal Reserve Board in Washington.
Over the next century, the Fed's problems didn't come from its structure, which divided interest rate votes between publicly appointed board members in Washington and privately appointed regional bank presidents, and sent any profits to the U.S. Treasury. What would plague the Fed instead, in each of its three major crises, was its reluctance to abandon old ideas, even in the face of mounting danger.
Trying to overturn an intellectual consensus forged amongst the reputed best economists in the world is not so easy. It's not so easy.
Congress created the Fed to forge a better monetary system. But in the Fed's first crisis, it failed to recognize that the world around it had radically changed. That the gold standard, a centuries-old system the Fed had been created to manage, was on the verge of collapse.
There used to be a country called Great Britain. Now we call it the UK, or Britain. And Great Britain was this little tiny place that had this wonderful world-beating banking system and a currency that passed for good money the world over. This currency was backed by gold. You could, not that many people felt they had to, walk into the Bank of England and exchange your banknotes for gold at a certain rate.
So the gold standard, making your money tied to a precious metal, is a way of stabilizing its value and restricting the ability both of banks and the governments to create too much paper money. But that world came crashing apart in the summer of 1914 when World War I began.
To print the money needed to finance the war, the great powers of Europe abandoned the gold standard. With Britain bankrupt, and German society destroyed by hyperinflation, the U.S., its new Federal Reserve, and a gold-backed currency emerged preeminent.
The United States rose up and supplanted Britain, and the pound was demoted from being the world's great reserve currency.
The U.S. becomes the financial leader of the world almost sort of overnight.
While the world economy struggled, America's boomed, and the Fed realized it could use its influence not just in times of panic. Monetary policy, a power the Fed is still struggling to manage to this day, was born.
The Federal Reserve has the power to create money. If you or I run the printing press in our basement, we're counterfeiters. When the Federal Reserve runs the printing press, the electronic printing press, it's monetary policy.
Monetary policy is when the Fed uses its power to create or destroy money, to lower or raise interest rates. If it creates more money in the system, money becomes more available and interest rates fall, so we're more likely to borrow and spend. If the Fed takes money out of the system, we borrow and spend less and are more likely to save.
If you're raising rates, you want to slow economic activity to cool inflation. When you lower rates, you want to stimulate some economic activity.
The change in rates by the Fed is really a question of gas pedal versus brake.
In the 1920s, the Fed reached beyond its original mandate and began to use this newfound power to steer the U.S. economy.
The Fed moved into managing the overall macroeconomy. Now, unfortunately, its first foray into that was the Great Depression. Did not do a great job.
1920s saw the first instance of a Fed-induced boom and bust. At first, the Fed's low rates unintentionally helped fuel stock market and debt bubbles, which saw speculators borrow more money than the entire amount in circulation. An alarmed Fed then clamped down, raising rates aggressively in 1928 and setting the stage for a recession and stock market crash.
Right after the crash, the New York Fed did exactly the right thing. It provided liquidity to the New York money market. It prevented a banking panic. Now, the board in Washington wasn't too happy about this. They were worried the expansionary policies the Federal Reserve was following would lead to a reignition of speculation and an inflation. So the Fed stopped its easing policy. Well, then trouble hit the banking system, and the Fed did nothing.
As banks began to fail, people withdrew deposits and stuck them under the mattress. Now banks didn't have money to make new loans, and the economy spiraled down.
Because we were still on the gold standard, we had trouble figuring out what to do. We tried to protect our gold position, which required raising rates, at exactly the wrong time. My grandfather, for example, went on vacation 2 weeks down to Kentucky, came back and their bank had been closed and they lost $3,000 worth of savings.
And so instead of providing enough money to prevent prices from falling, the Fed allowed the money supply to collapse. And that's what turned what would have been a garden variety recession into the Depression.
It wasn't that the Fed deliberately created the Great Depression.
They desperately wanted to fix what was going on. They just had the wrong diagnosis. That's a view that is widely shared now. The current Federal Reserve Chairman, Ben Bernanke, has said, we did it, we being the Federal Reserve. We caused the Great Depression and we won't do it again.
They were wrong. They learned by the pain and suffering that we all felt as a result of that. First great mistake was the Great Depression. The other great mistake was the Great Inflation.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
30 years after World War I tore apart the gold standard, a new system was finally created to replace it in 1944. The US dollar would be linked to gold, and the rest of the world would link their currencies to the US dollar. The Fed would be the banker to the world.
But shortly after agreeing to the Bretton Woods system, Congress passed the Employment Act of 1946.
The country decided to add to the Fed's mission, stabilizing employment over the business cycle.
No one wanted another depression. People were afraid of another depression. But that conflicted with what they had agreed to at Bretton Woods, because Bretton Woods told them they had to control inflation. Well, they weren't about to do that.
The best things in life are free, but you can give them to the birds or bees that need money.
In the next great crisis, the problem wasn't too little money, but too much.
Money, yeah, that's what I want.
Fear of unemployment was the new ideology, which, like the gold standard, the Fed would abandon only after great social cost.
The middle of the 1960s was a very nice period.
There was no inflation, no unemployment, and a lot of self-congratulation in Washington, D.C. They finally had got it. Fiscal policy would be just so, monetary policy just so, and we would have the kingdom of heaven right here in the United States of America.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson announced a sweeping vision to transform the country into what he called the Great Society.
However, beneath the surface of things, there was trouble.
Johnson's Great Society programs and his massive escalation of the war in Vietnam drastically increased government spending and caused prices in the U.S. to shoot higher.
The war in Vietnam was, like all wars, the cause of a governmentally orchestrated inflation.
To protect the value of the dollar, Fed Chairman Bill Martin needed to raise interest rates, as he had done since 1951. But Lyndon Johnson was a different kind of president.
Johnson said, no, we don't want interest rates to rise. We don't want to derail the Great Society. We don't want to create a recession. We've got a war to fight. And the Fed caved in.
He knew that he shouldn't be doing that, but he believed it wasn't his responsibility to tell the Congress they couldn't run deficits.
I've talked for a long time about the independence of the Federal Reserve. That's independence within the government, not independence of the government.
So if there was a big private investment boom, he could raise interest rates to stop it. But if there was a big public expenditure boom, that was not his responsibility to stop. That was the Congress.
The results were disastrous. Vietnam and then Johnson's Great Society programs on top of that was too much demand for the economy, created this immense inflation.
At Bretton Woods, the U.S. had promised to be the world's reserve currency, backed by gold. But the Fed had created far more dollars than it could ever redeem in gold. And now the U.S. could no longer keep that promise.
And by 1971, it was clear the dollar could no longer be exchanged into gold. Finally, President Nixon, in front of a television camera, bumping, I think, Gunsmoke off the air. Maybe it was Bonanza.
Bonanza will be shown after a special report from NBC News.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
And that began the modern age of inflation.
For the first time in history, the dollar was just a piece of paper, backed only by faith in the Federal Reserve and its policies.
Now, what does this mean for you? Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today.
That promise was only as good as the Fed actions behind it. But bowing to pressure from Nixon and clinging to flawed economic theories, the Fed refused to raise rates. Over the next decade, the cost of living more than doubled, as the dollar lost more than half its value.
They would tell each other, we're not going to let the inflation get out of hand this time. And then the unemployment rate would rise, and all that would be forgotten, because the political pressures would grow. Where did they come from? It came from Congress, it came from the administration, it came from the business community, it came from the labor unions, and it was just very hard to resist. The whole climate of opinion was against them.
And Arthur Burns, chairman of the Fed, he did not do what a good central banker should do and raise rates to break the inflation. And by the time the 70s ended, it was a total mess.
Prices went up infamously during the Carter presidency.
Inflation was increasing and unemployment was increasing at the same time. That wasn't supposed to happen.
Inflation hits everybody. Unemployment, even at its worst, hits only about 10% of the population at any one time. And so the public shifted its concern from unemployment to inflation in a massive way.
People began to say, we don't want it. We won't stand for policies that create ongoing inflation.
I really hate it because you pay so much for so little.
Good evening. Prices in the United States during the first 3 months of 1979 went up at an annual rate of 13%.
The question. Hi, this is Alan Kepler on the Smooth Jazz Top 20 Countdown. We have a real treat for you today. Live from London, it's Paul Hardcastle, who on this very day went to #1 with Lucky Star. In fact, it's his 9th #1 here in the States. Hey, Paul, welcome. Hey, listen, first of all, how would you describe what it takes to achieve your ambitions? And what's your outlook on life in general?
That's a good question, actually.
This life is no rehearsal. One chance to live our dream. Here today, gone tomorrow. Can we fulfill our destiny? Da-da-da-do-do-do-da. Time flies, it's no illusion. No one lives forever. You got one chance to make it happen. One life to live your way. Don't stop, reach for heaven. One chance, so make your choice today. Make a wish, keep it a secret. Why should you live with regrets? Don't give up, always remember the chance you missed, the time you'll not forget. You got one chance to make it happen. One life to live your way. Don't stop, reach for heaven. One chance, so make your choice today. Here today, gone tomorrow. Live a dream. You got one chance to make it happen. One life to live your way. It's up to you. Don't stop. Reach for heaven. One chance, so make your choice today. One chance. Here today, gone tomorrow.
That's a good question, actually. What advice have I got for someone that's trying to achieve their goal in life? Well, first of all, I would say never give up. Believe in what you're doing, believe in yourself, and just go for your dream. I think you only get one chance at what you're trying to do, so I think take it. In fact, I believe you only get one really good chance in life, and I think you should make the most of it. Here today, gone tomorrow, as they say.
Here today, gone tomorrow.
Here today, gone tomorrow. This life's not a rehearsal, is it? It's the real thing, so I think you really have to make the most of it. Time really does fly.
Time flies.
Here today, gone tomorrow. You only get one chance.
One chance to make it happen.
One chance.
One chance to make it happen.
One chance.